The plane buzzed with pre-flight chatter as passengers settled into their seats, the gentle hum of the engines providing a soothing backdrop. Among them, a sharply dressed black man strolled confidently down the aisle, a sleek leather bag slung over his shoulder. His tailored suit and polished demeanor radiated a quiet authority, yet the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, the atmosphere subtly shifted. A flight attendant, young and immaculately dressed, glanced up and froze for a moment before pasting on a strained smile. Her eyes darted to his boarding pass, as if seeking confirmation of what her instincts told her couldn't be true. Her voice, overly polite but with an edge of suspicion, broke through the man's calm. "Excuse me, sir," she said, blocking his path just as he reached the plush seat he had been assigned. "I think you might be in the wrong section." The man raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "I'm quite sure this is my seat," he replied evenly, holding up his ticket for her to see. But the attendant wasn't convinced. She scrutinized the ticket, her expression tightening. "I'll need to double-check this," she said briskly, stepping away without another word, leaving him standing awkwardly in the aisle as other passengers cast curious glances his way. The man remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of knowing confidence, as if he could already see how this would play out, and it was just getting started. The flight attendant returned moments later, her posture stiff and her smile forced. "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems there may have been a mix-up. Are you certain you're in the right seat?" The man didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he maintained an air of composure that only deepened the growing discomfort in the air. "I'm certain," he said, his tone steady and assured. "I booked this seat weeks ago." Other passengers were beginning to notice now. The awkward energy in the cabin spread like ripples in a pond. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others blatantly stared, their faces betraying curiosity, embarrassment, or worse, quiet agreement with the attendant's assumption. The attendant hesitated, as though debating her next move. Then, with a faintly condescending air, she added, "Perhaps you'd like me to guide you back to the main cabin. It's easy to get turned around in an unfamiliar airport." For the first time, the man's calm exterior faltered just slightly. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile, and he tilted his head, studying her. Turned around, he repeated slowly, almost as if savoring the absurdity of the suggestion. "No, I don't think I'm lost, but I appreciate your concern." By now, the exchange had drawn the attention of nearly every passenger in first class. Whispers passed between rows, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others craning their necks to get a better view. The attendant, sensing the scrutiny, pressed on, her voice firming. "Sir, if you don't mind, I'll need to confirm your ticket with the gate agent before we proceed." The man leaned back slightly, his expression unchanging. "By all means," he said smoothly. "But you might want to take another look at that ticket before you do." There was something in his tone, something measured and deliberate, that left the attendant blinking, caught between confusion and unease. She glanced at the ticket again, but this time her confidence seemed to waver. And still, the man stood there, unruffled, as though he were waiting for the perfect moment to speak the words that would change everything. The attendant turned on her heel, muttering an insincere apology before marching back toward the front of the plane to consult with the gate agent. The man remained standing in the aisle, a calm, collected figure amidst the awkward tension. Passengers in first class exchanged uneasy glances, while those in coach, craning their necks to see, whispered among themselves. The moments dragged on. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spectacle, one that, despite his composed demeanor, the man was clearly all too familiar with. "Is there a problem, sir?" A deep voice interrupted. It was another flight attendant, a senior crew member with a practiced but genuine smile. She had been watching the situation unfold from a distance, and now approached with a tone that suggested she wasn't pleased with her colleague's handling of the situation. The man met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "No problem at all," he said evenly. "Just a misunderstanding, I believe." The senior attendant glanced at the empty seat and then at the man's ticket in his hand. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by an almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. She knew, but instead of reacting immediately, she stepped aside to let the first attendant return with the gate agent in tow. The younger attendant looked smug, as if she'd finally have the authority to prove her assumption correct. The gate agent, however, seemed confused, holding the ticket and scanning it with a small handheld device. "This ticket is valid," the agent confirmed, his voice neutral but curious. "Seat 3A in first class. Is there an issue?" The flight attendant's face flushed slightly, but she wasn't ready to let it go. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her tone betraying her disbelief. "I mean I've seen—" The man held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His calmness was unshaken, but there was a steeliness to his gaze now. "I think this has gone far enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that silenced the murmurs around them. Everyone in earshot leaned in slightly, waiting for his next words, the tension in the cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, with a faint smile, he added, "I can assure you I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. In fact," he glanced at his watch, then back at the attendant, "if we don't sort this out soon, this flight won't leave on time. And that would be unfortunate for everyone." The flight attendant blinked, her confusion deepening. The gate agent exchanged a glance with the senior attendant, whose expression now teetered between exasperation and anticipation, as if she knew what was coming but was waiting for the moment to unfold. The man adjusted his tie slightly, his calm composure never faltering. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and yet the reveal wasn't quite there yet. The tension built higher, a silent question hovering in the air. Who was this man, and why did he seem so unfazed by this ordeal? The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but the man spoke first. "Perhaps I should explain," he began, his voice carrying the kind of weight that commanded undivided attention. The room held its collective breath. What he was about to say would change everything. The man straightened his posture, his calm yet commanding presence silencing even the faint whispers from the passengers around him. He looked directly at the younger flight attendant, his tone remaining measured but firm. "You seem quite determined to question whether I belong here," he began, his words deliberate. "And I can't help but wonder what exactly gave you that impression." The attendant flushed, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came out. Her previous air of confidence was quickly crumbling under the weight of his steady gaze. The senior flight attendant stepped forward slightly, her brow furrowed, clearly debating whether to intervene. The gate agent remained frozen, caught in the crossfire of the unfolding drama. The man continued, his voice carrying effortlessly over the quiet cabin. "You've checked my ticket, confirmed it with the gate agent, and yet you're still not convinced. Is it my clothing, my demeanor, or is it simply—" he paused, letting the silence hang for just a beat longer than necessary, "that I don't look like the kind of person you expect to see in this seat?" A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some visibly squirming in their seats. The question lingered in the air, its weight undeniable. The flight attendant's face reddened further, and she stammered, "No, sir, it's not that. I was just trying to help." The man interrupted gently, his tone calm but pointed, "because that's not how it felt." The senior attendant stepped in at last, her voice low but firm. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding, if there's anything I can do." But the man held up a hand, stopping her. "No need for apologies yet," he said, his gaze flicking back to the younger attendant. "I think there's a lesson here that's more valuable than words." The tension in the cabin was now almost unbearable. The younger flight attendant seemed trapped, unsure whether to defend herself or admit fault. The man, however, remained collected, his poise an undeniable contrast to the unraveling situation around him. He took a slow step forward, his voice quiet but no less authoritative. "Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you noticed the uniformed crew member who's been watching this entire exchange?" The younger attendant blinked, confused. "Uniformed crew member," she repeated, glancing around. The man gestured subtly toward the back of the first-class cabin. Heads turned in unison, eyes landing on a woman in pilot's attire standing silently, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The recognition dawned instantly. This was no ordinary observer. The young flight attendant's jaw dropped slightly, her face draining of color. Her gaze snapped back to the man, her confusion morphing into dawning realization. "Yes," the man said, his tone now laced with the faintest edge of amusement. "She's been watching, and so has everyone else." He paused, his next words ready to land like a lightning strike. "And so have I. You see, I'm not just a passenger in first class." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for all to see. "I'm the pilot of this flight." Gasps rippled through the cabin, and the stunned silence that followed was deafening. The young flight attendant's face turned a shade of crimson that matched the airline logo on her scarf. The man's eyes never left hers as he slipped the badge back into his pocket. "Now," he said calmly, "shall we proceed, or is there anything else you'd like to verify?" The young attendant stood frozen, her lips quivering as she tried to form a coherent response. The weight of her actions, and their implications, hung heavily in the air. But the man wasn't finished. The story wasn't done. Not yet. The silence was suffocating. The younger flight attendant looked like she wished the floor would swallow her whole. Her confidence, so evident moments earlier, had evaporated under the piercing gaze of the man who had just revealed himself to be the pilot of the flight. Passengers murmured among themselves now, the low hum of their disbelief filling the cabin. A few shook their heads, others leaned toward their seatmates to exchange quiet words. One or two had the audacity to chuckle under their breath, amused by the stunning twist of events. The man, however, remained composed, his calm demeanor only adding to the weight of the moment. "You see," he said, addressing the young flight attendant once more, "assumptions can be dangerous, especially in a professional setting." His tone wasn't cruel, nor was it condescending. It was measured, deliberate, and layered with the kind of wisdom that came from years of navigating situations just like this one. Situations where his competence, his authority, or even his presence had been unfairly questioned. "I've been in this industry for over a decade," he continued, glancing around the cabin as if inviting everyone to listen. "I've flown planes across continents, in every weather condition you can imagine. I've been trusted with the lives of hundreds of passengers at a time, and yet, here we are. Me still having to justify why I deserve to be standing in this very spot." The young attendant's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Her gaze darted toward the senior attendant, silently pleading for support. But the older woman gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, signaling that this was a lesson the younger woman would need to face on her own. "Now," the man said, his voice softening slightly, though the strength behind it remained, "I understand mistakes happen, but this wasn't just a mistake, was it? You didn't stop me because you were confused. You stopped me because you saw me, and you assumed I couldn't belong here." The flight attendant opened her mouth to protest, but the man held up a hand. "Don't," he said simply, the word carrying a weight that silenced her instantly. "Don't deny it. Don't try to explain it away. Own it." For a moment she looked like she might cry. Her face was a mixture of shame, embarrassment, and a dawning realization of the gravity of what she'd done. The senior attendant stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Captain," she said quietly, using the title with deliberate respect, "perhaps we can move this conversation to a more private setting." But the man shook his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "No," he said firmly, "this isn't just about me. This is about everyone in this cabin, everyone who watched this happen, everyone who needs to understand that these assumptions, these snap judgments, they're not harmless." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. Even those who had quietly sided with the young attendant moments ago now looked away, clearly grappling with their own complicity in the moment. The pilot glanced around one more time, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "This is a lesson," he said, his voice rising slightly to ensure he was heard, "for all of us." And with that, he turned back to the young attendant. "Now let's make a choice," he said gently but firmly. "Do we learn from this, or do we let it happen again?" The attendant's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she managed, her words trembling with sincerity. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to," the pilot finished for her. "But you did. And now you know better." The resolution was still taking shape, the cabin hanging on every word, every action, and yet the story was far from over. Lessons were being learned, but the journey wasn't quite complete. The young flight attendant remained frozen in place, tears pooling in her eyes but refusing to spill. Her apology hung in the air, vulnerable and raw, but it didn't erase the discomfort that lingered among the passengers. Everyone seemed to feel the weight of the moment, as though the pilot's words had peeled back a layer of society that many preferred to ignore. The pilot nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said, his voice gentler now. "But the next step is doing better, not just today, but every day going forward." He gestured toward the passengers behind him, many of whom were still staring, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with looks of quiet approval. "You weren't the only one making assumptions," he added, scanning the room. "I could feel it from the moment I walked in. The stares, the whispers, the judgment. It wasn't just her mistake, it's a mindset, and that mindset has consequences." The cabin fell silent again, his words striking a chord that no one could ignore. A middle-aged man seated in 2C shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A woman in 3B let out a quiet sigh, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Even the gate agent, who had stood by without intervening earlier, looked down at his clipboard, suddenly fascinated by its contents. The senior flight attendant finally broke the silence, stepping forward to address the younger woman. "Emily," she said softly, her tone carrying both compassion and firmness, "take a moment, collect yourself. Then, when you're ready, I'd like you to offer the captain the apology he deserves, properly." Emily, her name now revealed, nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she clutched her service tablet. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, before retreating to the galley at the front of the plane. The pilot turned back toward his assigned seat, but instead of sitting down, he addressed the rest of the cabin. "I know this was uncomfortable to watch," he said, his tone calm but unyielding, "but sometimes discomfort is necessary for growth. What happened here isn't unique. It's not the first time, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. But it can be a turning point for her, for all of us." The cabin remained quiet, the passengers visibly absorbing his words. A few nodded subtly, while others avoided his gaze entirely. The tension that had earlier felt suffocating now carried a different weight, one of introspection and the undeniable truth of what had just been exposed. Finally, the senior attendant stepped closer to him, her voice quiet but filled with respect. "Captain, on behalf of the crew, I'd like to sincerely apologize for what happened. We'll make sure this is addressed thoroughly." The pilot gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely appeased. "I appreciate that," he said simply. He finally took his seat, his movements calm and deliberate. The rest of the passengers, unsure of how to proceed, slowly returned to their own routines, adjusting seatbelts, scrolling through their phones, or staring blankly out the windows. But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. The younger flight attendant, Emily, emerged from the galley after a few moments, her composure shakily restored. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, her expression contrite. She approached the pilot cautiously, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Captain," she began, her eyes cast downward, "I want to sincerely apologize for the way I treated you. It was wrong of me to make assumptions, and I know I need to do better. I'm sorry." The pilot studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "I hope you take this experience and use it to grow, not just as a crew member, but as a person." Emily nodded quickly, her eyes still filled with shame. "I will," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. As she retreated back toward the galley, the pilot leaned back in his seat, finally allowing himself a moment of quiet. But even as the immediate situation seemed to resolve, the echoes of the incident lingered in the air. This wasn't just about one interaction, it was about the larger culture that had made such an interaction possible. The passengers, too, seemed to feel it. The weight of the lesson wasn't just for Emily, it was for all of them. And though the plane was finally preparing to depart, the story unfolding in that first-class cabin wasn't quite finished. The plane's engines roared softly as the final boarding announcements played over the intercom, but the energy inside the first-class cabin was anything but routine. Emily had retreated to the galley, leaving the senior flight attendant to manage the cabin for the remainder of the flight. The passengers, though outwardly settled, were still quietly reflecting on what they had witnessed. As the pilot sat in his seat, gazing out the window, he could feel the weight of the stairs around him. Some passengers seemed curious, others remorseful, and a few appeared downright uncomfortable. He allowed the silence to linger, knowing the moment was far from over. After a few minutes, the man in seat 2C cleared his throat awkwardly. He was a business executive type, clad in a crisp suit with a laptop balanced on his tray table. "Excuse me, Captain," he said hesitantly, his voice cutting through the subdued atmosphere. The pilot turned to face him, his expression neutral. Yes, the man adjusted his tie, clearly nervous. "I just wanted to say, well, I'm sorry for the way that played out. I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been for you." The pilot tilted his head slightly, regarding the man with quiet scrutiny. "Frustrating," he repeated. "That's an understatement, but thank you for acknowledging it." The man nodded, his discomfort evident. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I've probably been guilty of similar assumptions myself. Watching that just now, it made me think, maybe we all have some things we need to unlearn." The pilot's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of approval crossing his face. "Unlearning is a good start," he replied, "but it's about more than that. It's about choosing to see people for who they are, not for what you expect them to be." The man nodded again, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're absolutely right. I'll remember that." Their exchange seemed to break the tension in the cabin. Other passengers, emboldened by the interaction, began to speak up as well. "I have to admit," said the woman in 3B, her voice quiet but firm, "I was one of the people who assumed, well, the wrong thing. I feel terrible about it now." The pilot turned to her, his expression patient but unrelenting. "Acknowledging it is important," he said, "but what matters is what you do next. This isn't just about me. It's about what you carry forward from this moment." The woman nodded, her face reddening. "Thank you. I'll do better." The murmurs of reflection spread throughout the cabin, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts solemn and hopeful. Passengers who had been mere spectators now found themselves grappling with their own biases, questioning the assumptions they had made, not just in this moment, but throughout their lives. Even the senior flight attendant, who had remained poised throughout the ordeal, seemed moved by the unfolding dialogue. She approached the pilot once more, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Captain," she said, her tone sincere, "I'll make sure this is addressed in our post-flight review, not just with Emily, but with the entire crew." This was a wake-up call for all of us. The pilot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said simply, "it needs to be." For a moment the cabin seemed to settle, the initial tension replaced by a quiet determination. Yet the story wasn't over. The journey wasn't just about this one incident, it was about the ripple effects it would create, the changes it would inspire, and the lessons that would echo long after the plane landed. And the pilot knew this. As the engines revved in preparation for takeoff, he leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a brief moment of peace. But in his mind, the work was just beginning. The plane finally began to taxi down the runway, and the soft vibrations beneath the floor brought a sense of movement that mirrored the internal shifts occurring in the cabin. The pilot sat quietly in his seat, his gaze fixed forward, but his presence radiated an unspoken gravity. The passengers around him were subdued, each lost in their own thoughts. For some, the encounter had been a slap in the face, a raw, unfiltered reminder of the prejudice still embedded in their assumptions. For others, it was a lesson they didn't realize they needed, leaving them grappling with questions they couldn't yet answer. In the galley, Emily stood alone, her back to the cabin as she tried to steady her breathing. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on her chest. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen, hadn't consciously intended to single him out. But the truth was undeniable. Her assumptions, born of biases she hadn't examined, had led her to this moment. The senior flight attendant appeared at her side, her presence calm but firm. "Emily," she said quietly, "it's not enough to feel bad about this. Feeling bad doesn't fix anything. You have to understand why this happened and figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen again." Emily nodded quickly, her voice shaky. "I know, I don't even know why I thought." The senior attendant held up a hand to stop her. "You don't need to explain it to me," she said. "But you do need to reflect on it, and not just for today. This is about who you are as a person and who you want to be going forward." Emily blinked back tears and took a deep breath, nodding again. "I will, I promise." Back in the cabin, the pilot shifted in his seat as the plane lifted off the ground. The roar of the engines filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about Emily, the passengers, and the countless other situations he'd faced that mirrored this one. How many times had he been doubted? How many times had his expertise been questioned simply because of how he looked? And how many times had he been forced to prove himself, not through his actions, but through his very existence? He glanced around the cabin, catching the eyes of a few passengers who quickly looked away. Yet some met his gaze, their expressions tinged with something he recognized. Respect, yes, but also understanding. He leaned back, his posture relaxed, but his mind far from at ease. This was a battle he fought every day, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew his worth and refused to let others define him. The flight attendant, Emily, emerged from the galley after a while, visibly more composed but still hesitant. She moved through the cabin, offering drinks and checking on passengers, her demeanor quieter than before. When she reached the pilot's seat, she paused, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a glass of water on his tray. "Captain," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines, "thank you for your patience earlier. I've learned a lot today, and I'm going to work on myself, I promise." He looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence linger. Then he nodded once, a small but significant gesture. "Good," he said simply, "that's all I ask." Emily stepped back, her relief palpable, and continued her work. Around the cabin, passengers observed the exchange with quiet reverence. The tension that had earlier gripped the space had shifted, replaced by something subtler, an unspoken sense of accountability and hope. Yet the pilot knew that one conversation wouldn't change the world. One apology, however sincere, wouldn't erase the years of bias and assumptions he had endured. But it was a step, and sometimes a single step could start a journey worth taking. The flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines blending with the quiet rustle of passengers settling into their routines. Drinks were served, conversations resumed, and the cabin gradually fell into the familiar rhythm of a long-haul flight. But beneath the surface, the energy was still different, subdued, reflective, and undeniably changed. The pilot sat quietly in his first-class seat, his presence a silent reminder of what had transpired. Though outwardly composed, his mind replayed the interaction with Emily and the subtle yet significant ripples it had caused. He had no illusions about the enormity of the challenge. Bias wasn't erased with a single conversation. It was an ongoing battle, one he had faced countless times and would undoubtedly face again. Yet he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out, and yet he had commanded the attention of an entire cabin. He had turned a moment of prejudice into a lesson, one that would, hopefully, linger far longer than the flight itself. Midway through the flight, the senior flight attendant approached him, a look of quiet determination on her face. She leaned down slightly to speak with him, her voice low enough to keep their conversation private. "Captain," she began, her tone earnest, "I wanted to let you know that I've already filed an internal report about what happened. This isn't something we take lightly, and I'll make sure it's addressed at every level." The pilot regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said simply, "but I hope it's more than just a report. This needs to be a conversation, one that keeps happening, not just when incidents like this occur." The attendant nodded, her expression serious. "You're absolutely right. It's a systemic issue, and we need to treat it as such. I'll do my part to make sure this sparks real change." He offered her a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and resolve. "That's all I ask." As the senior attendant returned to her duties, the pilot glanced around the cabin once more. Some passengers met his gaze with small nods of respect. Others avoided his eyes entirely, their own reflections clearly still playing out internally. And then, from the aisle, a voice broke the quiet. "Captain," it was a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, peeking out from behind his seat in coach. His wide eyes were filled with curiosity and awe. He had clearly worked up the courage to approach, despite his parents' whispered protests behind him. The pilot turned to him, his expression softening into a genuine smile. "Yes, young man." The boy hesitated, then asked in a shy but clear voice, "Are you really the pilot?" The cabin fell silent again, passengers turning their attention to the interaction. The pilot chuckled softly and nodded. "I am," he said. "Would you like to see something cool?" The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically. The pilot reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his captain's wings, holding them out for the boy to see. "These are my wings," he said. "They're a symbol of the responsibility I carry every time I step into the cockpit." The boy stared at them in awe, his mouth slightly open. "Wow," he whispered. "That's so cool." The pilot smiled again, then added, "And you know what? One day, if you work hard and believe in yourself, you could earn a pair of wings just like these." The boy's face lit up with a radiant smile, and he nodded eagerly. "I will," he said confidently. The moment was simple but profound, a reminder of why the pilot did what he did. Beyond the bias, beyond the assumptions, there was the chance to inspire, to change perspectives, and to leave an impression that could ripple far beyond a single flight. The boy's parents quickly ushered him back to his seat, offering the pilot a grateful nod. The cabin, though quiet again, felt lighter, almost as if the boy's innocent enthusiasm had washed away the lingering tension. But the pilot knew the real change wouldn't happen in a single day. It would be in the conversations that followed, the choices people made after stepping off the plane. It would be in how people like Emily, and everyone watching, decided to act the next time they were faced with a moment like this. And that was what kept him going, the promise of what could be, not just for him, but for everyone. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed, signaling the final stretch of the journey. Passengers adjusted their seats, packed away their belongings, and prepared for landing, but the atmosphere carried a quiet sense of resolve. The events of the flight had left an indelible mark, and the lessons learned would travel far beyond this aircraft. Emily emerged from the galley one last time, her steps tentative but purposeful. She moved to the pilot's seat and paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The quiet hum of the plane made her words audible to everyone nearby. "Captain," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know I've already apologized, but I wanted to say it again. I've been reflecting on what happened, and I understand now that my actions were rooted in assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. That's no excuse, but I want you to know I'm committed to being better, not just for you, but for everyone I serve in this role." The pilot regarded her for a long moment, his expression soft but unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said, his tone kind but firm. "Growth isn't about perfection, it's about progress. I hope you remember that going forward." Emily nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I will. Thank you for your patience, and for teaching me something I'll carry with me forever." With that, she returned to her duties, leaving the pilot to reflect. The plane touched down smoothly, the runway lights gliding past the windows as they taxied to the gate. As passengers began to disembark, many paused to offer the pilot a nod, a word of thanks, or even a handshake. The man in seat 2C lingered for a moment, looking the pilot in the eye. "You're not just a captain," he said quietly, his voice laced with admiration. "You're a leader. Thank you for the lesson." The pilot gave a faint smile. "Safe travels," he replied, shaking the man's hand. When the cabin had finally emptied, the senior flight attendant approached him one last time. "Captain," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "we have a lot of work to do, and I promise we'll do it. Thank you for handling this with grace. You've made an impact today." He nodded, his expression contemplative. "Let's hope it lasts," he said simply. As he made his way to the cockpit for the next leg of the journey, he couldn't help but think about the boy who had approached him earlier. That small moment of wonder and inspiration reminded him of the importance of his role, not just as a pilot, but as someone who could challenge perspectives and inspire change. The incident had been one of many he'd faced in his career, but this one felt different. The ripples it created had touched everyone aboard that flight. And though change wouldn't happen overnight, he knew that every step mattered, because real progress, like flying, wasn't just about getting off the ground. It was about staying the course, facing turbulence with strength, and landing with purpose. As he settled into the cockpit, preparing for takeoff, a faint smile crossed his face. This was just one flight, one moment, but it was also something more. It was a reminder of the power of resilience, of grace, and of standing firm in the face of prejudice. And as the engines roared to life once more, the plane soared into the sky, carrying with it not just passengers, but the promise of what could be, a future shaped by understanding, growth, and the courage to rise above assumptions.